The fever took Arya on the third day of autumn, the sort that bent reality and fractured time. Kale had seen it coming, in the way her fingers trembled when reaching for her teacup, and how the shadows beneath her eyes deepened like bruises on ripe fruit. "Just tired," she'd insisted that morning, her smile a fragile thing. Now, she thrashed in her bed, hair plastered to her forehead, lips moving in silent conversation with someone Kale couldn't see. "Hold her steady," the village healer instructed. Grinding herbs with practiced efficiency, the medicine smelled of bitter roots and false hope. Kale pressed his calloused hands against his sister's shoulders, the heat of her skin alarming against his palms. He was accustomed to heat, had grown up with hands hovering over his father's forge, but this was different. "Arya," he whispered, as if her name alone could anchor her to this world. "I'm here!" Her eyes snapped open, but the recognition he sought wasn't there. Instead, her pupils were ringed with gold, an unnatural light that shouldn't exist in human eyes. "The champion!" she gasped, her voice layered with another's, deeper, ancient. "They demand a champion." The healer froze, mortar and pestle suspended mid-grind. "Who demands?" Kale asked, dread pooling in his stomach. Arya's back arched impossibly, her mouth stretching into a rictus as words poured forth that weren't her own. "Bring us a champion, or she dies!" Golden light spilled from her mouth, coalescing into the translucent figure of a being draped in radiance, features too perfect to be human. "Please," Arya begged, her own voice breaking through momentarily. "Don't make them send anyone. The trials! No one survives the trials!" The divine apparition tilted its head, the gestures somehow both graceful and predatory. "That is the point, little mortal. That is always the point." With a dismissive flick of its wrist, the being left an amulet on Arya's chest, a disk of impossible gold that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. "When the champion is chosen, this will guide them to Avum." The being's voice was musical, devoid of mercy. "Choose wisely, or don't. The outcome remains the same." The golden light collapsed inward, leaving the room darker than before. Arya fell limp against her pillows, her breathing shallow but steady. Kale lifted the amulet with cautious fingers. It was unexpectedly heavy, engraved with spiraling patterns that seemed to shift when not directly observed. The village hall smelled of pine smoke and uncertainty. Elder Thorn sat at the head of the long table. His eyes, clouded with cataracts but sharp with wisdom, hadn't left the amulet since Kale placed it before him. "The trials of Avum," Thorn murmured, not touching the golden disc. "I had hoped they were just stories." "What are they?" Kale demanded. Arya's fever hadn't broken. Each moment spent away from her bedside felt like betrayal. Thorn sighed, the sound like autumn leaves crushed underfoot. "Once every 1,000 years, the gods demand a champion to attempt their gauntlet, a series of impossible tasks designed to test the limits of mortal capability. And if we refuse to send someone, then the divine illness that grips your sister will consume her, and likely spread to others." Thorn's gaze finally lifted to meet Kale's. "It is a divine command, not a request." Murmurs rippled through the gathered villagers. Fear had its own scent, Kale realized, like metal on the verge of warping. "Has anyone ever completed these trials?" he asked. Thorn's silence was answer enough. "So, we're meant to choose someone to die," Kale said flatly. "To appease the gods who see us as, what, entertainment?" "The proper word would be reminder," came a voice. The crowd parted for Magister Reeve, the village scholar. "The trials aren't sport," she continued, adjusting spectacles that magnified eyes already too knowing. "They're punishment. A recurring lesson that mortals should know their place." "What place?" Cale's voice hardened, the edge in it recognizable to those who'd first heard the ring of his hammer against steel. "Beneath them," Reeve answered simply. "Reverent. Obedient." The silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning strikes. "I'll do it," Cale said quietly. Eyes turned to him, some widening in shock, others narrowing in assessment. "Don't be absurd," Thorn said, though his tone lacked conviction. "You're a blacksmith, not a warrior or magician." "Those before me were warriors and magicians," Cale countered, "and they failed. Perhaps it's time for a different approach." "You underestimate the trials," Reeve warned. "They're not merely difficult. They're divine cruelty given form. Each challenge designed specifically to break not just body, but spirit." Cale reached for the amulet, his fingers hovering just above its surface. "Then, let me be broken. Better me than Arya. Better me than anyone else here." He looked around at the faces of his neighbors and friends, people he'd known his entire life, people who deserved to live theirs. "I have no illusions about my chances," he continued, "but I won't sit here and debate which of us should be sacrificed while my sister suffers." Later, as moonlight spilled through Arya's window, Cale sat beside her bed. Her breathing had steadied, though the unnatural gold still rimmed her pupils when her eyelids fluttered in dream. "I don't know if you can hear me," he whispered, smoothing damp hair from her forehead, "but I'm gonna fix this. I promise." From his pocket, he withdrew a pendant, a broken gear from their father's forge, its teeth worn smooth on one side. Etched into the metal, in his own uneven hand, were the words that his father had lived by. "What's made with love cannot be unmade." Carefully, he placed it around Arya's neck. "Something to remember me by," he murmured, "in case I don't..." He couldn't finish. Truth was, he knew exactly what awaited him. Not glory, not triumph, just an end. Hopefully with enough dignity to make Arya proud. Cale took the amulet from his other pocket, studying its impossible weight once more. Before doubt could take root, he slipped it over his head. The world fractured around him, not tearing, but unfolding, like a piece of parchment revealing its hidden creases. Colors inverted, sounds stretched into unrecognizable frequencies, and Cale felt himself pulled along dimensions he had no words for. Then, stillness. He stood at the base of an impossible structure, a tower that shouldn't exist by any laws of architecture he knew. It spiraled upward, parts of it rotating in directions that hurt to perceive, others remaining unnaturally still despite the movement around them. Avum. "Well," came a voice like distant thunder, "this is unexpected!" Cale turned slowly, keeping his breathing measured despite the hammering of his heart. Before him stood three figures, if standing was the right word for beings who seemed to both occupy space and transcend it. The first appeared as a woman, formed from living marble, veins of gold threading through her skin. The second, a man whose form rippled with barely contained storm clouds and lightning. The third defied definition entirely, a presence that shifted between shadow and blinding light, leaving after images on Cale's vision. "A blacksmith," the storm man noted, lightning flashing between his teeth as he spoke. "No divine blood, no magical affinity." He circled Cale, the air crackling around him. "What do you hope to accomplish here, mortal?" "I'm here to save my sister." "Noble," said the third entity, its voice somehow both whisper and scream. Futile, but noble. The marble woman drifted closer, her movements fluid despite her apparent density. Do you understand what the trials are, blacksmith? A test, Kale replied. One designed to be failed. A ripple of something, surprise perhaps, passed between the divine beings. The storm man laughed, the sound like breaking glass. He thinks he can bargain with us, as if we haven't heard every plea, every promise, every desperate negotiation. I'm not here to bargain, Kale said firmly. I'm here to attempt your trials. If I fail, I fail. But I won't stand idle while my sister suffers for your amusement. The third entity pulsed, its form contracting and expanding. Curious. Most arrive believing they will succeed. Their hubris is entertaining. I harbor no such delusions, Kale said. Then why try at all? Asked the marble woman. Kale thought of Arya, of her laugh that could coax flowers from winter soil, of her kindness that asked nothing in return. He thought of his village, of people who had already endured more than their share of hardship. Because some things are worth fighting for, he answered simply, even when victory seems impossible. The gods exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Very well, the storm man finally declared. Let the trials commence. Let us see what you're capable of, blacksmith. Avum shuddered around them, stone grinding against stone as the tower began to reshape itself. Walls collapsed and reformed, staircases twisted into new configurations, and great mechanical gears emerged from hidden recesses. Kale watched as the tower transformed into a reflection of himself, worn, practical, resilient. A fortress of gears and cogs, of metal and stone. A place where strength was measured not in power, but in endurance. The first trial awaits, the marble woman announced, her form already fading. The trial of stone. Many before you have been crushed beneath its weight. As the gods vanished, their final words lingered in the air. You have until sunset. Then your sister's time begins to wane. Left alone, Kale studied the transformed tower. Ahead, a massive doorway loomed, its surface inscribed with warnings in languages both familiar and alien. But among them, one message stood out in clear, cruel text. Strength alone prevails. Taking a deep breath, Kale stepped forward, not with the confidence of a hero, but with the steady resolve of someone who understood that moving forward was the only option left. The door sealed behind him with the finality of a tomb. The trial of stone was exactly as advertised. A cavernous chamber stretched before Kale, its ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow. At its center stood a column of impossibly dense stone, not one piece, but hundreds of slabs stacked atop each other, each easily weighing more than a house. Etched into the floor, around it, was a simple instruction. Lift. Kale approached cautiously, circling the monolith. Previous challengers had left their mark, bloodstains on the lower stones, fingernails embedded in the rock, even a shattered sword whose blade had splintered against the unyielding surface. He placed his palm against the first slab, cold, immovable, like touching the heart of a mountain. Strength alone prevails, he muttered, repeating the inscription from the entryway. But something about that didn't sit right. The gods had made it clear. These trials were designed to be failed. If brute force was truly the answer, then why would they present this challenge to someone they had just mocked for lacking divine strength? Kale circled the column again, this time looking beyond the obvious. His eyes traced the seams between the slabs, noticing the precision of their alignment, too perfect to be natural. Almost like machinery, he breathed. Years at the forge had taught him how to see the mechanics in all things, how parts fitted together, how pressure and counterweight could move objects beyond human strength. Kneeling, he examined the base of the column more carefully. There, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for them, thin channels cut into the floor, radiating outward from the central pillar. Cale followed one to the wall, where it disappeared in what appeared to be solid stone. But pressing his ear against the surface, he detected it. The faint, rhythmic sound of something mechanical. This wasn't just a test of strength. It was a machine. For the next hour, Cale methodically mapped the chamber, identifying pressure plates hidden beneath loose flagstones, tracing conduits that ran through the walls. The entire room was an elaborate mechanism. The slabs were meant to be raised not by brute force, but by activating a counterweight system. Previous champions had likely spent their energy trying to lift the immovable column, never realizing the true nature of the trial. By the time the hidden sun within Avum had begun its descent toward the horizon, Cale had identified the control points, 5 pressure plates positioned at specific points around the chamber. Standing on any one wouldn't trigger the mechanism. They needed simultaneous pressure. A team of 5 could manage it easily, but he was alone. Cale studied the plates thoughtfully, then glanced at the debris left by previous challengers. Pieces of armor, broken weapons, even skeletal remains. Resources, to a blacksmith's eye. Working quickly, he gathered what he needed. A cracked shield, splintered spear shafts, then rusted links of chainmail. From his own pockets came the tools he never traveled without. A small hammer, pliers, a length of wire. As sunset approached, Cale stood before his makeshift solution. 4 crude weights, each positioned above a pressure plate, held suspended by lengths of wire that converged at the 5th plate. One pull would release all 4 weights simultaneously, while he stood on the 5th. "Worth a try," he muttered, positioning himself. With the sun's final light filtering through hidden windows, Cale yanked the central wire. The weights dropped. 5 pressure plates engaged as one. For a moment, nothing happened. Then came a sound of groaning from deep within the walls, the sound of ancient machinery awakening. The floor trembled. Dust rained from the ceiling. Slowly, impossibly, the column of stone began to rise, each slab separating from the one below, as hidden platforms elevated them in sequence. As the final slab cleared the floor, a doorway was revealed beneath the column's base, a passage forward. Cale stood motionless for a moment, hardly believing his success. Then, favoring a leg bruised during his explorations, he limped toward the opening. Behind him, the machinery shuddered to a halt. The column remained suspended, defying gravity through mechanical ingenuity rather than divine intervention. As Cale passed through the doorway, he felt rather than heard the presence of the gods return. "Interesting," came the marble woman's voice, though her form remained invisible. "He didn't try to prove his strength." "He circumvented the challenge entirely," the storm man replied, displeasure evident in the static charge that filled the air. Cale continued forward, not acknowledging their presence. But deep within, something small and defiant kindled. Not hope, exactly, but its stubborn predecessor. The refusal to surrender without a fight. Behind him, the doorway sealed, and the Trial of Stone entered legend as the first to be conquered in 1,000 years. The corridor beyond the Trial of Stone twisted like the inside of a conch shell, each turn bringing Cale deeper into Avum's impossible geography. The walls here were different, no longer stone, but a material that seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding in slow, deliberate rhythm. Each step was for area, although he couldn't shake the feeling that something else drove him now. The desire to show that humanity deserved better than to be perpetual entertainment for divine boredom. The passageway widened suddenly, opening into a chamber that defied expectation. Unlike the brutalist architecture of the Trial of Stone, this room was almost welcoming. Circular, with a domed ceiling displaying an artificial sky where twin moons hung impossibly close. At its center burned a fire like none Cale had ever seen. Flames in shades he had no names for danced above a hearth that seemed composed of pure, distilled darkness. Above the fire, words shimmered in the heated air. The trial of flame demands what you cannot live without. Kale approached cautiously. The warmth of the fire should have intensified with proximity, yet the air grew colder with each step. By the time he stood at the hearth's edge, his breath frosted before him. "Curious design," he murmured, studying the unnatural flame. It consumed nothing, yet burned eternally. Around the hearth's perimeter, evidence of previous challengers told their stories. A golden crown, partially melted. A sword whose blade had been replaced with diamond. An eye preserved in crystal, yet still somehow seeing. All offerings, all rejected. "What you cannot live without," Kale repeated thoughtfully. An important distinction. He circled the hearth once more, then knelt beside it. The cold intensified, seeping into his bones until his teeth chattered uncontrollably. "What can I live without?" he asked himself. His first thought was of Arya. Her smile, her kindness, the fierce protectiveness he felt toward her. But that wasn't something he could physically offer to the flames. Or could he? The realization settled over him like a mantle of frost. The fire didn't want objects. It wanted something more fundamental. With trembling fingers, Kale reached toward his temple, not to remove an eye or slice flesh, but to touch something far more precious. A memory. "I offer what I cannot live without," he declared to the waiting flames. "My memory of the person I came to save." The fire surged upward, its colors shifting toward a hungry violet. An invitation. Kale hesitated. To forget Arya. It seemed a betrayal of everything he'd come here to accomplish. Yet, if he failed this trial, she would suffer regardless. He thrust his hand into the flame. Pain beyond imagination engulfed him. Not physical burning, but the sensation of something essential being extracted through every pore of his skin. Images flashed before his eyes. Arya as a toddler, clutching his finger with surprising strength. Arya at 10, defending a wounded fox from village boys with stones. Arya last autumn, weaving crowns of maple leaves for the harvest festival. Each memory flickered, then dissolved, leaving behind spaces of nothing where something precious had been. When Kale finally withdrew his hand, he found it unmarked. But the hollowness inside him could not be ignored. A clean excision where something vital had existed. He knew, intellectually, that he had come to Avon for someone. But her face? Her name? The sound of her laughter? Gone, consumed by the hungry flame. The fire, appeased, receded to its previous height. A doorway materialized in the chamber wall. As Kale rose on unsteady legs, the marble goddess appeared beside him, her expression unreadable. "Most offer physical sacrifices," she observed. "Eyes, hands, hearts." Kale looked at her, his gaze steady despite the new emptiness behind it. "Physical pain ends. This won't." "You've forgotten why you came," she noted, not unkindly. "Most would consider that a failure of purpose." "I remember that my village needs me to succeed," Kale replied. "The details may be gone, but the obligation remains. I haven't forgotten my purpose. Only the person behind it." The goddess's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough to suggest something unexpected had occurred. "Proceed, blacksmith. The trial of echoes awaits." As she faded from view, Kale felt the strange, persistent ache of something missing, like a phantom limb, but located somewhere in his chest instead. He pressed a hand against his sternum, trying to soothe a pain that had no physical origin. Whatever, whoever, he had forgotten must have been important. The thought brought both sadness and determination. He would continue, if only to honor the sacrifice of memory. With one last look at the unearthly flame, Kale stepped through the newly formed doorway and into the next trial. The trial of echoes began with silence so complete it felt like pressure against Kale's eardrums. He stood in darkness, unable to see even his hand before his face. Then, without warning, light blazed around him, not from any discernible source, but as though reality itself had suddenly illuminated. He found himself standing in a perfect replica of his village square. "Hello?" Kale called, his voice falling strangely flat, as though the air absorbed sound. Movement caught his eye. A figure hurrying across the square, head bowed against non-existent wind. With a jolt of disorientation, Kale recognized himself. Not quite himself. This doppelganger was thinner, wilder-eyed, clothes torn and muddied as though he'd fled through forest. The false Kale paused mid-stride, turning slowly to face the real one. When he spoke, his voice emerged as Kale's own, but distorted. Higher, threaded with panic. "I ran! I couldn't save her! I was too afraid to try!" Before Kale could respond, the scene shifted. The village square dissolved, reforming as the interior of a modest home. A girl lay in bed, her features oddly blurred, as though viewed through clouded glass. Something about her tugged at the empty space in Kale's memory. Another version of himself sat beside the bed, this one older, bitter-faced, shoulders hunched with defeat. "I tried everything," this echo said, not looking up. "But I was too weak, too stupid. I let her die, believing I could save her." The scene shifted again, and again, each time showing a different version of himself. One who abandoned his quest out of cowardice, another who fought but failed through incompetence, a third who grew to resent the burden placed upon him. Each failure, each a reflection of fear Kale recognized within himself. "The trial of echoes," came the storm god's voice from everywhere and nowhere, "where champions face their truest reflections." Kale understood now. This wasn't just illusion. It was weaponized doubt. A hall of mirrors designed to reflect his worst possibilities until he no longer believed himself capable of success. "These aren't reflections," Kale replied steadily. "They're projections. Fears, not truths." Laughter rippled through the air. "Are they not one and the same? What we fear most often defines us more accurately than what we hope." The illusions continued their parade. Kale watched versions of himself break, run, fail, betray. But something unexpected happened as the visions progressed. The blurred girl appeared in each one, sometimes dying, sometimes abandoned, sometimes begging for help. And despite not recognizing her, despite the hollow space where her identity should be, Kale felt himself responding, not with fear or doubt, but with a bone-deep certainty that he would never abandon her, whoever she was. "I don't know who she is," he admitted aloud, watching an echo of himself turn away from her outstretched hand. "But I know I wouldn't leave her like this." He stepped forward, through an illusion of himself cowering in a corner. It dissolved around him like mist. One by one, he walked through the echoes of failure. Each dissolved at his touch, their power diminishing with his refusal to accept them as inevitable. "Interesting," came the storm god's voice, tinged with something almost like respect. "You are meant to break here, confronted with your inadequacies." "Perhaps that's the problem with your trials," Kale replied. "You assume we're unaware of our weaknesses. But any craftsman knows their limitations intimately. That's how we work around them." The last echo stood before him, a version of himself that had just given up entirely, sitting with empty eyes beside the indistinct girl's deathbed. As Kale approached, his final illusion looked up, its expression changing from despair to confusion. "Why continue?" it asked. You don't even remember her name. Kale reached out, placing a hand on his echo's shoulder. I don't need to remember her name to know she deserves my best effort. She's human, just like me. The illusion stared back, then nodded slowly, dissolving like the others. The fabricated village faded, replaced by a simple stone corridor leading onward. The corridor stretched before him, leading deeper into Avum's impossible architecture. Somewhere ahead waited the trial of blood, combat according to the patterns emerging. Kale flexed his hands, callous from years at the forge, but unprepared for battle. As he walked forward steadily, guided by something more reliable than memory, the unwavering certainty that someone depended on him, and that alone was reason enough to continue. The trial of blood made no pretense about its purpose. The corridor opened into a vast arena, sand underfoot, weathered stone rising in tiers around its perimeter, and ancient stains darkening the ground in patterns that told stories of defeat. At the center stood a figure that seemed both solid and transparent simultaneously, a man of indeterminate age, clad in armor that reflected light in ways that hurt to observe directly. His face bore the perfect symmetry of divinity, marred only by eyes that had witnessed too much. The last champion, came the third god's voice, rippling through reality like heat distortion. Or what remains of him? 1,000 years of failure given form. The fallen demigod turned toward Kale, his movements unnaturally fluid. When he spoke, his voice resonated from multiple sources at once. Another sacrifice. Another disappointment. Kale studied his opponent carefully. Unlike the previous trials, this one appeared straightforward. Combat to the death. No hidden mechanisms, no psychological manipulation. Just blood on sand. I'm not here to fight you, Kale said. The demigod laughed, the sound fracturing like glass. That's not your choice to make. But without warning, he lunged forward, impossibly fast, a blur of motion that defied human reflexes. Kale barely managed to dive aside, feeling the whisper of a blade pass where his throat had been moments before. Rolling to his feet, Kale found himself facing a weapon he hadn't initially noticed. A spear composed of what looked like solidified moonlight, its edges constantly shifting between states of matter. The trial of blood has one purpose, the demigod announced, circling Kale with predatory grace. To remind mortals that divine always trumps human effort. He attacked again, this time with a sweeping arc that Kale blocked with a piece of debris, snatched from the arena floor. The impromptu shield shattered on impact, fragments slicing into Kale's forearm. I've watched 1,000 champions die, the demigod continued, his voice detached. Some fought well, others begged, all failed. Another strike, another desperate evasion. Kale felt warm blood trickling down his side where the spear's edge had grazed him. Why do you continue? Kale asked, circling to maintain distance. 1,000 years of this? Don't you tire of being their instrument? Something flickered across the demigod's perfect features. Surprise, perhaps, at being addressed as something other than an obstacle. I have no choice, he replied, his attack rhythm faltering momentarily. This is my punishment for failure. So, you punish others for the same? Kale pressed, seizing the momentary hesitation. Perpetuating the cycle? The demigod's expression darkened. You know nothing of cycles, mortal. Nothing of time's cruel circle. He lunged again, but his movement seemed less fluid now, tinged with something almost like doubt. Kale dodged, but not quickly enough. The spear sliced through his left hand, severing 2 fingers in a clean, nearly painless cut. Kale gasped, stumbling backward as blood pulsed from the wound. The pain hit a moment later, white-hot and clarifying. First blood. the demigod noted dispassionately. "Usually I take a limb. You move well, for a craftsman." Clutching his maimed hand, Kale backed away, thoughts racing. This wasn't a trial he could solve with mechanical insight or psychological resistance. This required something else entirely. "Tell me," Kale said, voice steady despite the pain radiating up his arm. "What did you seek to prove when you entered the trials?" The demigod paused, spear poised for another strike. "What? 1,000 years ago, what did you hope to demonstrate?" "Worthiness," the demigod answered after hesitation, the word emerging reluctantly. "That mortals with divine blood deserved respect. And instead, you became their cautionary tale," Kale observed. "Their instrument of punishment against others like yourself." Anger flashed across the demigod's features, and he attacked with renewed vigor. This time, Kale couldn't evade. The spear drove toward his chest with unstoppable force. But at the last possible moment, Kale stepped into the strike, rather than away from it. The spear's trajectory shifted, its blade slicing along his ribs, rather than through his heart. He grabbed the shaft with his uninjured hand, holding fast despite the material's burning cold against his palm. "I'm not here to defeat you," Kale said, his face inches from his opponent's. "I'm here to save someone, just as you once were." The demigod stared back, confusion warring with eons of conditioned violence. "You can't save anyone," he snarled, though his grip on the spear had loosened imperceptibly. "No champion ever does." "Perhaps that's because they try to win, rather than understand." Blood dripped between them, pooling on the ancient sand. Kale and the demigod's gazes remained locked, one determined despite pain, the other wavering after centuries of certainty. "What is there to understand?" the demigod finally asked, confusion genuine in his voice. "The trials exist to punish hubris. Yet the gods chose you as their instrument, a failed champion, rather than punishing you directly." Kale winced as pain radiated from his wounded hand. "Why?" The demigod's expression shifted, something ancient and buried surfacing briefly. I don't... "Because your failure serves them better than your death would have," Kale pressed. "Because watching you break others reinforces your own brokenness." The spear trembled between them. "They've made you complicit," Kale continued, his voice softening. "Turn you into the very thing you once defied." For a moment, nothing moved in the arena. Then, slowly, the demigod withdrew his weapon, taking a step back. "You speak dangerous thoughts, blacksmith," he said, though his posture had changed, less predatory, more uncertain. "Truth often is." Kale straightened, still clutching his bleeding hand. "I don't ask you to help me, only to consider whether defeating me serves your original purpose or theirs." The demigod looked down at the spear in his hands, as though seeing it for the first time. When he spoke again, his voice had shed some of its ethereal quality, becoming almost human. 1,000 years I've stood in this arena. 1,000 champions I've broken." He looked up, meeting Kale's gaze with newfound clarity. "None ever spoke to me as anything but an obstacle." "Perhaps that's why they failed," Kale suggested. Something shifted in the arena's atmosphere, a tension releasing, like the moment when heated metal finally yields to the hammer's persuasion. The demigod lowered his weapon entirely, then, in a gesture that seemed to require immense effort, knelt on the blood-stained sand. "I yield," he declared. Not to Kale, but to the watching gods. "Find another instrument for your cruelty." For a breathless moment, nothing happened. Then, the demigod's form began to change, solidifying, the transparency giving way to something more definitively real. The perfect symmetry of his features softened, humanity returning to eyes too long vacant. "What happens now?" Kale asked quietly. The demigod looked at his hands, fully corporal now, no longer shifting between states. "I don't know. I never imagined freedom." Before any more could be said, light engulfed the kneeling figure. Not the cold illumination of divine judgment, but something warmer, almost gentle. When it faded, the demigod was gone, leaving only a small object gleaming on the sand. Kale approached cautiously, then bent to retrieve it despite the pain in his injured hand. A medallion, half gold and half silver, engraved with a simple message: compassion where strength failed. As he straightened, the arena dissolved around him, reforming into a small, circular chamber with a single doorway leading onward. Beside it stood all three gods, their expressions ranging from curiosity to poorly concealed displeasure. "You turned our own weapon against us," the storm god observed, lightning crackling between his teeth. "No," Kale corrected, tucking the medallion into his pocket. "I reminded him of his own purpose. There's a difference." "You've passed 3 trials," the marble goddess noted, "more than any champion before you." "Yet you grow weaker with each," added the third entity, its form fluctuating between states. "Blood lost, fingers taken, memory sacrificed." Kale nodded, acknowledging the truth of this. "The cost is high, but necessary, it seems." "You still don't understand," the storm god said, almost pitying now. "These trials aren't meant to be survived, let alone completed." "Perhaps that's the problem," Kale replied. "You designed them with failure as the only acceptable outcome. But humans, we tend to redefine parameters when faced with impossibility." The gods exchanged glances, a silent communication that rippled through reality itself. "Proceed if you wish," the marble goddess finally said. "The trial of the starless sky awaits. None have ever emerged from it with sanity intact." Kale looked down at his maimed hand, at the blood still seeping through his makeshift bandage. His body ached from exertion and injury. The hollow space in his memory throbbed like an extraction wound. Yet, he stepped toward the doorway without hesitation. "Why?" asked the third entity, genuine curiosity in its shifting voice. "You don't even remember who you fight for." Kale paused, considering this. "I remember enough," he finally said. "I remember that someone believes I'll try my best. That's sufficient." He passed through the doorway, leaving the gods in a silence that, for immortal beings unaccustomed to surprise, felt uncomfortably close to awe. The trial of the starless sky began with vertigo, a sensation of falling despite standing on solid ground. Kel found himself in perfect darkness, not the absence of light, but its negation, a void that consumed illumination rather than merely lacking it. He extended his uninjured hand, encountering nothing. Took a cautious step forward, then another. The surface beneath his feet felt neither warm nor cold, neither rough nor smooth, a tactile impossibility that heightened his disorientation. "Hello?" he called, his voice disappearing without echo. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, gradually, pinpricks of light appeared overhead. Not stars, but something mimicking them, arranged in patterns that tugged at Kale's memory, despite their alienness. A voice emerged from the void, not the gods' voices, but something softer, achingly familiar despite the hollow space in his mind, where recognition should reside. "Kale!" He turned, following the sound, and found himself no longer in darkness, but in a humble room illuminated by candlelight. At its center lay a bed, and in it a young woman whose features seemed to shift and blur, refusing to settle into anything recognizable. Yet something about her pulled at him, a connection that transcended the memory the flame had consumed. "You've forgotten me," she said, her voice carrying neither accusation nor surprise. "Just as I feared you would." "I'm sorry," Cale replied, instinctively moving closer. He reached for her hand, only to find his own passing through hers, as though she were made of mist. "You're not real," he realized aloud. "Does that matter?" she asked. "Real or not, I'm dying. The god's curse consumes me while you wander these trials." Pain lanced through Cale, not physical, but a deeper anguish tied to the empty space in his mind. "Tell me your name," he pleaded. "Help me remember." Her form flickered, features blurring further. "Would that change anything? Would you fight harder if you remembered?" Cale faltered, unsure. The room darkened around them, candles guttering as though in a sudden draft. When the woman spoke again, her voice had changed. Multiple tones layered into a discordant harmony. "This is your darkest night, blacksmith. Not failure, not death, but the realization that your struggle means nothing, that those you fight for fade, regardless of your efforts." Something cold and heavy settled in Cale's chest. Not doubt, precisely, but a bone-deep weariness. What difference did his effort make? Champions had tried for millennia, each believing themselves the exception. He looked down at his maimed hand, at the empty spaces where fingers had been, at the scars from the trial of blood still seeping red into his tattered shirt. So much sacrifice. To what end? The darkness pressed closer, the void expanding within and around him. It would be so easy to surrender now, to accept what thousands before him had, that the trials were unwinnable by design. The visions continued their relentless parade, the woman alone, afraid, life ebbing with each labored breath. And then, unexpectedly, anger kindled within Cale. Not the hot, reactive anger of youth, but something deeper, steadier. A smith's anger, banked like coals and all the more potent for its containment. "No," he said quietly. The visions paused, particles hanging suspended in the void. "You think to break me with futility," Cale continued, his voice gaining strength. "To show me that my efforts mean nothing against divine will. But you've miscalculated." He stepped forward, through the floating particles that showed the dying woman. They scattered around him, reforming behind. "Humans don't continue fighting because we believe we'll win," he declared. "We fight because the alternative, doing nothing, is unacceptable." The void rippled, cosmic perspectives contracting as though the gods had drawn closer to hear. "You've designed these trials to be impossible," Cale acknowledged, "to remind us of our limitations. And yes, I've sacrificed much to reach this point. But here's what you don't understand," he continued, conviction strengthening his voice. "Every sacrifice was freely given. Not because I believed I would succeed where others failed, but because someone needed me to try." The particles around him began to vibrate, their movements suggesting agitation. "You call this my darkest night," Cale pressed on. "You think showing me a dying woman whose name I no longer remember will break my resolve. But you're wrong." He stepped forward again, the void reluctantly giving way before him. "I see her suffering," he admitted. "I feel the hollow where her name should be. And it doesn't weaken me. It reminds me why I'm here." The cosmic perspective shattered, fragments of light scattering into darkness. For a moment, Kale stood alone in the void, nothing but blackness surrounding him. Then, gradually, a doorway materialized before him, not ornate or imposing, but simple, almost humble. Beyond it, light pulsed with steady invitation. As Kale approached, the gods' voices returned, quieter now. "You rage against inevitability," they said. "A mortal defiance that, while admirable, changes nothing." "It's not your approval I seek," Kale said. He stepped through the doorway, leaving the trial of the starless sky behind. On the other side waited the final challenge, the true purpose of Avum, hidden beneath millennia of divine misdirection. The trial of godhood. The chamber beyond held none of the grandeur Kale might have expected from a place where divinity itself was supposedly tested. Instead, it resembled nothing so much as a blacksmith's forge. Humble, functional, focused on creation rather than appearance. At its center stood an anvil of material he couldn't identify, neither metal nor stone, but something that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Beside it, a forge burned with the same otherworldly flame he had encountered earlier, its colors shifting through spectrums both familiar and alien. Tools hung on the walls, hammers, tongs, chisels, all crafted with impossible precision. The air smelled of hot metal and possibility. Above the anvil, words formed in the heated air. "Create your god self. To pass, you must become what we are." Kale circled the forge slowly, taking in every detail. Unlike previous chambers, this one bore no evidence of past champions, no remnants of failure, no warnings carved in stone or blood. "No one has reached this trial before," came the marble goddess's voice as she materialized beside him. "You stand at a threshold no mortal has crossed." Another entity formed before him, its shifting appearance settling momentarily into something almost human. "Ascension awaits, blacksmith." Kale approached the anvil, running his fingers across its surface. "I'm to forge myself?" he asked, turning to face the gods. "To create a divine version of what I am?" When he looked back at the gods, they were gone. Kale found himself alone. Understanding dawned slowly, pieces falling into place like the components of a complex mechanism. "The trials," Kale said quietly. "They weren't tests of worthiness. They were preparation, stripping away what makes us human." Kale picked up a hammer from the wall, testing its weight. Perfect balance, as though crafted specifically for his hand, even accounting for his missing fingers. Kale placed the hammer back on its hook, then selected a different one. Heavier, designed for shaping rather than finishing work. "I've spent my life studying creation," he said, returning to the anvil. He spoke knowing the gods could hear. "The transformation of raw material into something purposeful, something beautiful." He examined the forge's flame, noting how it responded to his presence, brightening, as though eager to participate in whatever he might create. "I understand the appeal," Kale continued. The gods watched silently as he selected tongs, laying them beside the anvil in preparation. "But there's something you haven't considered." Kale considered all his injuries, the space in his memory, all he had sacrificed to reach this point. "The value of imperfection." The gods exchanged glances, confusion passing between them like a current. He turned to the forge, its flame dancing with expectation. For a long moment, he studied it. This fire meant to transform mortal into god. Then, decision made, he reached for a blank of metal from beneath the anvil. Not to shape himself anew, but to create something else entirely. He withdrew the now glowing metal, placing it upon the anvil. With precise strikes of the hammer, he began to shape it, Not into anything grand or divine, but into something small, personal, human. Under his guidance, the metal took form, a small sculpture of a laughing girl. Not detailed enough to be recognizable as any specific person, but capturing an essence of joy, of humanity, of the very things the gods had tried to strip away. He continued working, adding details with smaller tools, a tilt to the head suggesting curiosity, hands open in welcome, face turned upward as though greeting the sun. As he worked, something unexpected happened. The forge's otherworldly flame began to change. The gods noticed too, their expressions moving from displeasure to confusion, then to something approaching alarm. "The forge responds to him," the marble goddess murmured. "It adapts to his purpose, rather than imposing ours." Kale continued unaffected by their reactions. His hands moved with the assurance of someone who had spent a lifetime creating, not divine works, but honest ones, practical, meaningful. Finally, he set down his tools. The sculpture stood complete on the anvil, small enough to hold in one hand, yet somehow containing more presence than the chamber itself. "It's finished," he said simply. "This isn't what the trial demanded," the third entity reminded him, though its voice had lost its earlier certainty. "No," Kale agreed, "but it's what humanity offers instead of godhood. Not perfection, but connection. Not transcendence, but meaning." He lifted the sculpture, examining it from different angles, not searching for flaws to correct, but appreciating the entirety of what he'd created. "I choose this," he declared, facing the gods directly. "I choose to remain human, to keep my imperfections, my limitations, my mortality, because these are not weaknesses. They're the source of everything worthwhile." For a moment, silence filled the chamber, a silence heavy with realization. Then, unexpectedly, the forge erupted, flames shooting upward in a column of pure white light. The anvil cracked down its center. The tools on the walls vibrated, then dissolved into particles of light. The very foundations of Avum shuddered. "What have you done?" demanded the storm god, lightning flaring around him in agitation. Kale held the sculpture protectively, unflinching in the face of divine displeasure. "I've rejected your premise, completed your impossible trials not by becoming a god, but by remaining steadfastly human." The white light expanded, consuming the chamber walls, unmaking the forge, the anvil, everything except the small space where Kale stood with his creation. The marble goddess frowned. "The trials were designed to be failed or to transform. You've done neither." "I've done both," Kale corrected. "Failed to become what you intended. Transformed into something else entirely. Someone who understands the values of his humanity enough to refuse divinity itself." The light continued its advance, unmaking Avum piece by piece. The gods' forms began to waver, their presence diminishing as the foundation of their construct collapsed around them. As Avum collapsed around them, dissolving into particles of light that hung suspended before vanishing entirely, the gods' forms dissolved completely, leaving Kale alone in the void of gentle, welcoming light. He closed his eyes, the sculpture warm against his chest, and surrendered to whatever might come next. Not with a god's confidence and control, but with a human's courage in uncertainty. Avum unraveled around him, its impossibility yielding to something far more radical. The beauty of the imperfect, the sacredness of the limited, the preciousness of the finite. Home. Kale awakened to the scent of pine smoke and herbs, not the alien fragrances of Avum, but the familiar smells of his village in autumn. For a long moment, he lay still, cataloging sensations. Rough blanket against skin. Sunlight warming his face through an eastern window. Distant voices engaged in morning routines. Home. Somehow, impossibly, home. He sat up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in his limbs. Memory returned in fragments, not in the ordered progression of time, but in emotional resonance. The trials, the gods, the forge where he had rejected divinity in favor of humanity. Looking down at his left hand, he found what he expected. The missing fingers. Healed now, but permanently absent. A reminder, perhaps. Evidence that his journey had been real rather than a dream. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The door opened before he could respond, revealing a young woman with a tray of food and medicinal tea. "You're awake," she said, voice colored with relief. "Elder Thorn said you might be. Today." Cale stared at her, something tugging painfully at the edges of his consciousness. He knew this person. Knew her in some fundamental way that transcended memory. But her name, her relationship to him, these remained frustratingly beyond reach. She approached, setting the tray beside him, studying his face with increasing concern. "Cale?" she asked hesitantly. The truth strangled in his throat. How to explain that he felt her importance, without remembering why? Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by profound sadness. Not surprise, he noted. "The gods took your memory of me," she stated. Not a question, but a certainty. Cale nodded, relieved at not having to explain. "And you chose me," she whispered, voice caught between hurt and something else. A reluctant understanding, perhaps. "Not you," Cale corrected gently. "My memory of you. It seems an important distinction." She sat on the edge of the bed, close, but careful not to touch him. The silence between them vibrated with all that had been lost. "My name is Arya," she finally said. "I'm your sister." Sister. The word echoed in the hollow space where her memory should have resided. It felt right, though he couldn't explain why. "You're feeling better," he observed, noting her clear eyes, the healthy flush in her cheeks. Last he remembered, someone, Arya it must have been, lay dying from a divine illness. "The moment you stopped wearing that cursed amulet, the fever broke," she explained. "Days later, you've reappeared on the village green. Unconscious, but alive." A pause. "That was 2 weeks ago." 2 weeks. He'd lost time as well as memory. "The god's amulet?" he asked. "Vanished, along with the illness." She studied him carefully. "No one expected you to return. The legends are all ended the same way. Champions entered Ava and were never seen again." Cale absorbed this, trying to reconcile with the extraordinary events of the trials and the ordinary reality of his room. This moment. This woman who was both stranger and kin. The pain of this, of having hurt someone whose protection had driven him to the trials in the first place, settled in his chest like a stone. "I'm sorry," he said again, knowing the inadequacy of the words. "Don't." Arya's voice strengthened, an unexpected fierceness emerging. "Don't apologize for saving my life. For defying gods. For doing the impossible." "But I've lost you," Cale said simply. "That seems like a high price." At this, something changed in Arya's expression. Determination replacing sorrow. She reached beneath her collar, withdrawing a pendant on a simple leather cord. Cale recognized it immediately. A broken gear from their father's forge, engraved with words he knew by heart. "What's made with love cannot be unmade." "You gave this to me when I was 7, she said, holding it out to him. The pendant caught the morning light, its worn surfaces gleaming dully. The metal was warm from her skin, its weight comforting in his hand. Familiar, though he couldn't place why. He looked down at the pendant in his palm, then at the sculpture he had created without knowing who it represented. He realized now, it was Arya herself. 2 pieces of metal, shaped by the same hands, carrying the same essence across time and impossibility. "I may not remember you," he acknowledged, meeting her gaze directly. "But I recognize you, nonetheless." Arya smiled and gestured to the pendant. "You said it was a part of your heart, shaped into metal so I could keep it with me always." Kale smiled. "Good. Then it stayed with you. We'll make new memories." Arya hesitated, then reached out slowly, taking his injured hand in hers. She traced the healed stumps where 2 fingers had been, her touch gentle but unflinching. Outside, the village continued its rhythms, lives touched but not fundamentally altered by the breaking of an eternal cycle. Children laughed, tradespeople called their wares, farmers tended fields ripening toward harvest. None knew that the age of gods had ended, that divine interest in human affairs had suffered a blow from which it might never recover, that trials, meant to reinforce mortal limitations, had instead revealed their greatest strength, the capacity to value connection over perfection, to choose compassion over power. In houses of worship across the world, priests would soon discover their prayers met with silence. Oracles would find their visions clouded. Prophecies would go unfulfilled. That which makes us worthy isn't perfection or power. It's the willingness to suffer for others, to rise again, not because we believe we can win, but because someone else needs us to try. For some, bonds transcend memory. Some connections require neither recognition nor recollection to remain true. Some loves, once forged, cannot be unmade, not by time, not by distance, not even by gods.